Hi, everybody. Welcome to 192 Books. We're here for the launch of the New York tapes, Alan Solomon's interviews for television, 1965-1966, edited by Matthew Sims, and we have Jacob Proctor in conversation with Elizabeth Smith and Robert Slifkin. This is presented in collaboration with the Paula Cooper Gallery, Lisa Knowlton, Xavier Danto. We have the books for sale over there after the conversation. And this is live streaming on YouTube and the Paula Cooper Gallery Studio website. I'm going to introduce Jacob. Jacob Proctor is the Gilbert and Ann Kinney New York collector at the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art, where he's responsible for new acquisitions from the New York area. He also conducts interviews for the Archive's long-running oral history program and organizes exhibitions and public programs relating to the Archive's collection. Previously, he was curator at the Museum Brandhorst in Munich, the Collegium for Culture and Society at the University of Chicago, the Aspen Art Museum, and the University of Michigan Museum of Art. Proctor has organized more than 40 exhibitions, including most recently major surveys of Alex Katz and Lucy Mackenzie. His writing appears in numerous exhibition catalogs, monographs, and periodicals. Thank you and welcome.
Excuse me, thank you, Gerard. Getting over cold, so hopefully my voice lasts. So I'm joined, thank you all for coming. I'm going to just introduce my two our panelists this evening, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book itself. Immediately to my left, Elizabeth Smith is the executive director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, based here in New York. Previously, she was executive director of curatorial affairs at the Art Gallery of Ontario, chief curator and deputy director of programs at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles. Besides Frankenthaler, we have a very esteemed guests here. Besides Frankenthaler, Smith's writings and exhibition projects have ranged from the work of artists Utabar, Louis Bontecu, and Janie Holzer to mid-century architectural topics, including blueprints for modern living, history and legacy of the case study houses. Her recent writings have appeared in Kathy Opie's 2021 Fiden monograph and Action, Gesture, Paint, Women, Artists, and Global Abstraction, 1940 to 1970, published by Whitechapel Gallery in 2023. Also joined by Robert Slifkin, who is the Edith Kitzmiller Professor of Fine Arts at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, where he teaches classes on modern contemporary art and photography. He's the author of Quitting Your Day Job, Chauncey Harris photographic work, published by MAC in 2022, which received the Historical Book Award at the All Call for the Photography in Arles. He's also the author of The New Monuments and The End of Man, U.S. Sculpture Between War and Peace, 1945 to 1975, published by Princeton University Press in 2019, and Out of Time, Philip Guston and the Refiguration of Post-War American Art, published by University of California Press in 2013, which is awarded the Phillips Book Prize. His essays and reviews have appeared in such journals as American Art, Art Forum, Art Bulletin, Art Journal, Burlington Magazine, October, Oxford Art Journal, and Racket. I think you're probably one of the very few people who's published in both Burlington Magazine and October. So thank you both for joining us. Thank you all for coming out in the rain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this book is. This book was edited by my close colleague Matthew Sims, who is the Gerald and Benty Buck West Coast collector for the Archives of American Art. We sort of divide things up geographically at the archives. And as a scholar, Matthew is a specialist in both European and American art in the 18th and 19th centuries and the art of post-war California. And in recent years, he's published important studies of Southern California artists Robert Irwin, Helen Pashkin, and Ed Ariel. And it was actually in the context of writing this book on Irwin that Matthew uncovered these long forgotten transcripts, which had been actually donated to the archives in 1974. Helen Solomon died in 1969 or 1970, I should say, and his executor was actually Castelli, which I didn't know until this. And he donated his papers, and they were included in the finding aid, but they weren't cross-indexed in those days, and so it wasn't until they started being digitized that Matthew found them in the context of his research on Irwin. And so this is actually the second volume, the second book that had been published with Circle Books of these interviews. The first was the Los Angeles tapes, which were the interviews with Irwin, Craig Kaufman, Larry Bell, and James Turrell, which is also great. I don't know if you have it here, but it's also great. So it's really amazing that we have this book now. This is quite a tome. Alan Solomon, for those of you who might not be familiar with him, was really quite a pioneering career, you could say, of American art in the 1960s. From 51 to 62, he became a professor of art history and was the founding director of the Art Museum at Cornell. And he had written his dissertation at Harvard on Picasso, which he must have been one of the very first people to write a dissertation on the living artist. I always thought that Rosalind Krauss was maybe the earliest, but apparently Alan Solomon, writing a dissertation in the 1940s and 50s on Picasso, he's very much still active. But he really kind of roared into public view in 1962 when he became the director of the Jewish Museum. And the recent Jewish Museum show, 1962 to 1964, that was Solomon's tenure. And so while he was there, he organized a series of really historically important exhibitions, including the first, I don't know if you call them retrospectives, of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg in 64 and 63, respectively. And they were both, retrospective of 10 years of work, not even. And also exhibitions like Toward a New Abstraction in 1963, which included the work of Kenneth Noland, Morris Lewis, Albert Kelly, Al Held, Frank Stella, and others. And he also organized the 1964 American Pavilion Venice Biennale, which included most of those artists, and where Rauschenberg famously won the Golden Lion, famously and controversially, I should say. And he also organized Warhol retrospective at the ICA Boston in 66, like the U.S. Pavilion in 67. So he was kind of everywhere. He also published in 1967 this big, beautiful, actual coffee table style book called New York, the New Art Scene, which was illustrated with these amazing photographs by Hugo Millas, which many of you may know, alongside Solomon's kind of texts on the artists. In 1968, he left New York and moved to Los Angeles to take up a job running the art department and the museum, or I think at UC Irvine, which was then still quite brand new. And he sort of suddenly died he was sick, but he died very young, at the age of 49 in 1970. So he had a very short, very career. So this book, the background on the book, it contains 17 interviews that were recorded in basically about 5 months between December of 1965 and April of 1966. And they were recorded for a program called USA Artists he was making with the producer and director of Lane Slate for what was then National Educational Television, which kind of became WNT, the US station here in the world. And it became 10 half-hour long episodes of the show. And so, of course, huge amounts of footage and of these interviews were not included in the episodes. And what happened was that Solomon, all the footage disappeared over the years. It just was gone. The original episodes are still in a couple of different archives. but none of the extra material is extant. And this set of transcripts in Alan Solomon's papers is really the only complete record of these interviews that exists. And as I said, it was basically forgotten and unknown for 40 years. Most of the interviews were recorded in New York, either in artist studios or in their homes, although he did travel, strongly travel. Kenneth Noland was interviewed in Vermont. Jasper Johns is interviewed both in New York and in Venice Beach, South Carolina. There are a couple of interviews that are coming in Washington, D.C., the Morris Lewis episode. And so there were single episodes on Johns, Rauschenberg, Oldenburg, Jim Dine, and Barnett Newman. And then there were two-person episodes. There was one featuring Lichtenstein and Warhol, another of Morris Lewis and Kenneth Noland, and a third of Frank, Stella, and Larry Poons. And so methodologically within the series, there are kind of two basic approaches. One of episodes that depend primarily on interviews with the artists themselves. And then there are some of the episodes which rely heavily on associates or other of the artists. And the Warhol is one which where we also have the interviews Gerard, Malanga, and Sedgwick. He interviews Leo Castelli, provides some kind of background on Rauschenberg and Johns. Although weirdly, he was interviewed on the same day as the Warhol, all the Warhol people. So I was expecting that interview to be about Warhol, but okay. And then, of course, with Morris Lewis, who had already been dead since 1962, they utilized exclusively on other sort of eyewitness accounts, I guess you could say. And so in that case, we have Marcella Brenner, who's his widow, Helen Jacobson, who was one of his students, and then Clement Greenberg, Helen Frankenthaler, and Kenneth Noland, who kind of does double duty both for his own review and for the Venice. And then I should also say that included in the Oldenburg transcript are kind of short interviews with Oldenburg's wife at the time, Helen, as well as his parents. And I think that these must have just been kind of more opportunistic because none of them actually made it in. They're quite short, and none of them actually made it into the broadcast. Although Patty is really funny and candid in her sort of assessment of her husband. He's a nice guy, but I like he seems to like his art more than she likes him. So the arc of the series essentially like maps onto Solomon's kind of larger curatorial project at the time, which he kind of articulated, his ideas about what he called the new art as at least two sort of parallel tracks, the new abstraction and the new figuration. And I think personally he was maybe a little more invested in the new figuration, but that's kind of how he was trying to explain kind of what was going on in art since the late 1950s. And he positions, for example, Johns and Rauschenberg very much as having kind of opened the door to pop art and happenings and everything else that happened in that sort of stream. And then, actually, very interestingly, really positions Frankenthaler as the gateway, the thing that allowed the practice, I should say, that allowed people like Lewis and Noland to kind of find a way to move on past the problem, essentially. So Solomon, with his serious art historical training, was of course he was educated and trained to kind of create these kinds of lineages, and his own bigger thoughts, to sort of group artists together into schools, identify period styles, etc. And so I think maybe my first question was to you, would be like sort of from our contemporary perspective, what are your thoughts on his efforts to kind of construct this particular genealogy or constellation, or sort of zeitgeist?
Well, when we were preparing this panel earlier last week, I was looking through the catalog to the museum show from a few years ago and came across this article we wrote in 1963 for Studio International. I think it's just called The New Art.
Yeah, it was the catalog essay for a show at I think it was the Institute of Contemporary Art or something in Washington about, it was like the new, I forget the title of the show.
Yeah, so it's mainly dealing with the figurative artist rather than the abstractionists. But it's funny, I just realized that I used the first sentence that essay as an epigraph from the first one and first lesson. So I was wondering why I knew about the article when I was sitting, where did that come from? But I hadn't read it for a year. And what's so remarkable about that text is it is this kind of diagnostic account of a new sensibility. And it's a sensibility that frames it in terms of expression of humanism, that there were people during abstract expressionism who were angry that art was becoming abstract and it lost contact with reality. And all they wanted was a return to imagery. But then he says, I don't think they wanted what has happened. And so he frames this new sensibility of the 60s as a kind of anti-humanist configuration, one that is fundamentally kind of ironic, maybe skeptical, unromantic. And I think what's so interesting about this corpus in this book is the way that artists like Johns and Rauschenberg and Oldenburg are in dialogue with artists like Noland and Frankenthaler and Morris, who on one level seem to be antithetical, but I think what Solomon recognized was that in some ways they both were simultaneously rejecting a certain kind of epic romanticism associated with abstract expressionism, and at the same time carrying this certain, I wouldn't say that there's a kind of, he recognizes a tradition that all these artists in their even kind of response to abstract expressionism are still engaged with it in some ways. So it really, I hadn't really thought about this academic training as an art historian. I didn't even know about dissertation on Picasso. That's really interesting.
And the iconography of Cubism.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, of course, that's the only way you could do it.
I'd like to read that. But you really do see that he is trying to see this both in terms of a genealogy and in terms of something new, as you say, kind of stylistic break. So for me, what's so interesting is precisely the way that he's, the whole divide between abstraction and figuration is not interesting to him. And I think from our contemporary perspective, we can see that that's no longer a meaningful distinction. I mean, I think that's been the case for a while. But that he's also recognizing that there's a way to paint representationally that doesn't have to be about depiction, that can be about something much more social. I mean, the other aspect is that he's so attuned to the question of the environment. And so that these artists are not so much depicting nature as they are depicting culture. And I think that's another place where these, someone like the colorful painters and the context related. It's an environmental aspect. He's always asking them about, and I read the LA one too. For them, it's why was living in Los Angeles affect your work? And most of the artists said no. And likewise, most of the artists who live in New York say no. It's not about that. It's about, in some ways, the media is what they're interested in. This kind of burgeoning media environment that we're all working in.
Yeah, interesting that he conducted this for LA interviews in preparation for a show that he did at the museum at Irvine. It was basically called like a new LA aesthetic or something like that.
You sense that he's committed to that. This idea that there is a sort of regional style. And of course, we all kind of feel that when we talk about Finnish fetish and light and space. There was something going on there that wasn't distinctive. But the artists were not. They were not interested in that.
He did seem, I agree with what you're saying, so it was so interesting to read that article, The New Art. It's not one I had read before, and the two of you had. And then to compare it, it's a very perceptive way of discussing what the artists were doing. And then, turning to the transcripts in this book and then watching some of the films, and he really seems to be somebody who was very invested in defining the new, and I thought that was also something interesting aspect of the whole period. And then I was really further digging, just to, to get more and refresh myself more in the context. I came across a number of articles written by others around the same time that dealing with this idea of the cool. The cool comes up a lot in analyses and discussions of this mid-60s period. I thought that was very interesting in how it relates to Solomon too.
That's the kind of anti-humanism. The idea that to be cool is not to be romantic, and it's to kind of look at things and not, with Warhol, if anybody recognizes this, not to really have feelings about it. To just see things and not judge. Be open. This is the radicality, I think, of these artists. In some ways, it's very skeptical of the past. I think this new sensibility is very much about. I would say there's a kind of irony to it. Not so much a kind of cynical irony, but looking at the world and not being open to the fact that things aren't what you think they are. I think Johns is very much. He got in his interview, he talks about the ironic stance, or weakness. The other word that he used that made come, I think, is neutral. But I wanted to take the American flag, this hard symbol, and neutralize it. And I think that speaks to that kind of coolness, just not approach things with preconceived ideas of what they might mean, but see them differently. And that's what I would do. Doing something different than what we think.
That kind of non-judgmental attitude I thought was very interesting, because when you read the transcript for someone like Clement Greenberg, he's going down a different path, and he continues to emphasize and talk about the quality. And the contemporary artists are they are involved with making work that has the same kind of quality as the work of the great artists in the past. Like very different approaches and viewpoints there.
Right. I mean, it's the difference between experience and judgment. That these are artists, even Noland. When you stare in front of like a Noland carving, it's an experience, kind of buzzy. Even though Greenberg might say, "Oh, but it's a good painter," and you're supposed to judge it. Ultimately, I think these are all artists. This piece again is kind of environmental or even theatrical aspect that that it's about. And the work hard that would be experience. You can't judge the experience. You just have them.
It's an interesting connection between the famous Stella dictum of what you see is what you see, versus like Noland, who's also probably comes pretty close to saying that in different words, but it's not you're not supposed to look at anything else. There's nothing else there other than paint on canvas. In another kind of environment that he talks about is he tries to get almost everybody to talk about their relationship with what he calls like the scene. And so I guess, and somewhat more obliquely, he also tries to get people to talk about the market. And I think on the one hand, you can sort of see this as he's already thinking about his next project, which is the New Art Scene book. I'm sure he must have already been working on that book when he did these interviews. And he's always asking them about who do they hang out with, what do they do, like what's their social life like, all this. Has success gone to your head, or like do you find it hard to, what is your commercial success specifically? Has that impacted you? And of course everybody's like, no. It just makes it so I don't have to worry about things and I can buy more paint. But I think it's also interesting in the way that is kind of interesting antecedent to some of our kind of the preoccupations of the kind of contemporary art world today. I don't know if you have thoughts about those exchanges. Some of them are kind of interesting.
Well, I was struck by that same thing. Also thinking about it in relation to other things and read by other writers, other interviewers at the same time, who also seemed interested in getting people to talk about the scene. And it just strikes me, and probably comment on this better than I can, but people that came up, like the artists that sort of came of age in like the late 40s and the early 50s and went through all that, that period. from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, you have such a huge change in the art world. You know, it was a very small community. You know, there weren't the collectors so much. It was just a completely different environment. And I was struck by the profound change that took place in that roughly 10-year period.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's the difference between, 10th Street, which was where all the abstract expressions more or less lived, but one street, one block in this village, to this idea now that Jasper Johns is in South Carolina some of the time, that there's a kind of expansiveness. And I think what the artists are responding to is precisely the sense that, no, we're not all hanging out at the city town. We have a much bigger point of reference. I think people like Oldenburg and Dine that was the Venice Theater that was given for Rauschenberg and for Rauschenberg it's like Black Mountain. All these different points of contact that are very different. It is the kind of beginning of the art world that we know. But it's Castelli. Castelli is the link for that new world where it is about market. But when you look at the Hugo Malus book that you mentioned, which is an incredible document, it's a large book with lots of photographs. And Sullivan's text is very smart. And another fine piece of scholarship. But even when you think this is 66, 67, so far along into the success of these artists, the Rauschenberg studio is still pretty dumpy. And this bed is right there on the ground, and there are dogs sleeping on it. I mean, this is not the art world that we would even think of as the 80s, let alone the 21st century. It's still a rather modest bohemian place. And I think that's, that it really is this crucial moment where, yes, they're enjoying some success, they're even on TV. I mean, that's something to think about in terms of, it's almost like Jackson Pollock magazine, but something else. But it's still, it's nothing like our world right now.
Also, in the TV, so I'm going to talk a little bit of in the TV shows. There's always a kind of omniscient narrator, and it's different narrators for different episodes. I don't think Solomon is ever a narrator though. But interestingly, Solomon and his own questions are almost entirely left out, with one exception being the Warhol episode, where he's like sitting in this kind of swivel chair talking to Warhol and trying to get Warhol to answer his questions, and Warhol just ends up making fun of him and repeating back what he says, which is, it's kind of interesting because Warhol makes Warhol in the show look much more unwilling to participate than he actually ends up being in the transcript, where he actually does open up at a certain point. But I mean, obviously, one of the things that the book does is it brings back that kind of dialogical structure of the interview, because you're not just hearing the artist responding, you're actually just reading the question also. And you have that kind of back and forth that you don't have in the show, in the television shows. And obviously he wasn't conducting these interviews as, like oral histories in the sense that we do today. He was doing them for a much more kind of instrumental purpose of making the show. But I wonder if you had thoughts on him as an interviewer and his sort of how he's conducting himself. And
it is remarkable to see how often he's stage managing. Saying, say that again. He's asking the episode twice he has to tell the story about how he first discovered Jasper Johns when he went to the Rauschenberg and Johns was taking him to meet him. So you get the sense that these interviews that have the effect of spontaneity are, prepared in many ways. So that was interesting in that regard. Indeed, the digressiveness is kind of remarkable. And anyone who's done the interview knows this, that what you read in the final version is a very small section of what actually is spoken, because you do have to kind of gain the trust of, Warhol. That is, it's remarkable because it begins as one of these classic Warhol interviews where he's not going to give an inch. But about 4 or 5 pages in, he starts actually saying some interesting things, and even kind of humane things. But you get that sense that he had to get there. And even with Nolan, where there's like a 4-page digression about sports cars, which, you know, if you're interested in 60s sports cars, I think those things are absolutely necessary to kind of get the artist to feel comfortable to actually speak, because these, you know, it's a difficult thing, because these are all people who've already been interviewed multiple times. And so how do you get them to say something both that is essential for the uninformed viewer who just wants to know about Jasper Johns' work, but then try to get them to view out of it. And I think Solomon does a pretty good job. I mean, you know, it's funny, he does have these sort of hobby voices that he returns to over and over again. You see that in the reading of it. But in general, I think it's an effective interviewer in that strategy.
It tussles a bit with, you know, people too, in ways that I thought was kind of interesting, trying to get them to make particular points, or, you know, you mentioned Castelli, and one of the things that stuck in my mind was I would say to Castelli, don't give me a lecture about, I guess Castelli was about to talk about the painting that was behind him, and
Don't give me the
I
sales
want to
pitch.
hear that, so like, go.
But he says that, I think, not because he doesn't want it, he doesn't want
He
that to be
doesn't
on
want
the
it to be on the
TV.
TV.
Right, I mean, I think this is something that's in the introduction, where you get the sense that he's very sensitive to avoid cliches. Right? He doesn't want people to just perform like they're artists on TV. He wants to kind of catch them much more naturally. And in many ways, I think it's successful. I hadn't seen any of these programs before I read this kind of stuff on YouTube, and they're pretty good. I mean, they're very well crafted. Yeah, they're well crafted, and that you really do get a sense of these artists we were talking before. What's also so amazing is that even the pop artists still kind of talk like 1940s people. You know, they have kind of such formality that no one can say. You know, but you realize again, this is a transitional moment. You know, Warhol, Warhol, and Rauschenberg doesn't do that. You know, even Oldenburg and they still talk like people who went to college before. They didn't kind of have it.
Yeah, I was very struck that Rauschenberg says "like" in the way that everyone says it now. He's the only one who does that. I mean, I think it's also interesting that you can tell. I feel like even though he had either worked on group shows or solo shows, with everybody who's ever done it, except Frankenthaler, because you know. But I think you can really tell in the Johns interview in particular, because it's also several different, you know, over the course of I think 3 or 4 sessions, you can tell that they already have such a rapport and there's such a level of trust between them that they can both have this kind of very, as I said, like instrumentalized conversation, but it's also still really like genuine and real. And I think that's really unusual for this kind of a project. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting about in terms of reading it. I think Nolan also, there's clearly a real friendship there, or at least a serious working relationship.
There's a bit more film that was with Frankenthaler said work together. In fact, I took a look at Frankenthaler's books from the time when he was supposed to interview them. So my colleague said, "How our archivist is here tonight." And I was amused to notice that Frankenthaler wrote "TV man here." And she noted that this interview was going to happen. So really there was some distance and they didn't really know each other yet. But something that I thought was really interesting that comes across in the book, but not on the film episode, is that, you know, Frankenthaler talks about her own work for a while in the transcript, whereas in the film's, you know, part, she's really part of a supporting cast that's talking about the work of Noland and Lewis, what they, you know, how they exemplify, you know, the new abstraction. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I hadn't expected that necessarily, so I became aware of the transcript film version.
There's a kind of hidden feminist discourse in this, especially with the interview with Oldenburg, where I moved in. really, Oldenburg says, I collaborated with him, and you really get a sense that all the self-films were really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, there's this great moment where she says that like at one point he fired her, quote unquote fired her, and said he was just going to do all the sewing himself. And she said, "Fine." That lasted exactly one day because he was so bad at it.
Right, and even the interview with Lewis's widow, you really get a sense of, this is the truism that these artists both obscured the women in their lives and relied on them fundamentally. You see that over and over again in these interviews.
Yeah, the outtake, I mean, the things that didn't, the Lewis episode, the Lewis and Nolan is one that you can watch on YouTube. But I thought some of the things that people said about Lewis that didn't make it in were also really telling. I thought Nolan's, there's this moment where, everybody, I think they will forever be talked about in the same sentence. And on the one hand, there's this some of what does get into the program is, kind of interesting and insightful things about how the sort of the balance of their relationship shifted over the years. But there's this crazy moment where Nolan is talking about this and says, like, Solomon asks him, I guess I can quote here, I can just read it. But Solomon asks Nolan about Lewis' death. And I feel like an exclamation mark. So he says, "Well, I was pretty shaken up because I had very ambiguous feelings toward Morris. I didn't trust him fully as a person. And on the other hand, I had extreme admiration and respect for his achievement as an artist of his stand." And that part is completely left out. It goes straight to the Morris was the most dedicated artist I've ever known in my life. Like dedicated, total commitment, all of this. But I thought there was Nolan in particular, his very frank assessments of his peers were quite interesting.
Well, that's also, there's this kind of Rauschenberg thing with Morris, where you have Greenberg, Frankenthaler, and Nolan all say he's so committed, and he wouldn't let anyone see him paint. Right? There's this kind of mystery of how those veil paintings were made, and so you get these multiple perspectives of this person who said, every day he painted, yet no one ever saw him paint. It's kind of it also relates to in the Oldenburg interview and Rauschenberg interview, you get these accounts of happenings in theater performances by Oldenburg and Rauschenberg respectively. And again, these are things that we've known about. There's a watch that happening at the place in the swimming pool that was watches. But the fact that you get another account of these things that we know exist because they were performative and ephemeral, every new account of them provides something new to it. So there's something about even, I knew that Morris didn't let people see his work, but the fact that you get these new accounts of the strangeness of that is really valuable.
Yeah, the accounts of the conversation, I think it was called like something like the theater jam, but it was a very funny
the one in Rauschenberg's studio.
Yeah, the one that Solomon had organized with Steve Paxton like a couple of years earlier, and that's I think that they're. But yeah, it is interesting. It's also about when Greenberg says, "Well, I bet Lewis would have let me see him paint, but it just never occurred to me to go and ask." And I'm like, "Oh, it never occurred to you to go and watch the artists working?" So typical, right?
Yes, I mean,
I think it's a picture at the end.
Nolan didn't trust him because Morris didn't trust anyone to allow him a little bit of the works. That's where that mistrust comes from.
There was something kind of wonderful that Lewis's widow said, stuck with me, something along the lines of that he had very few doubts, but he was full of doubt. I thought that's a pretty But I have to say, I was wondering about whether Frankenthaler understood. She must have understood that she was being asked to speak about Nolan and Lewis. But she did. But the interviewer did. Solomon did. Ask her a number of questions about her own practice, and whenever I'm reading something about Frankenthaler, is she saying something new here to what, I read in other contexts, and, much of it was similar. But she did say some new things, and one of the things that struck me is that she talked about her work in series, and she rarely talked about her work as a series. She said, oh, this series, based in landscape, and the series based in, globs of color, and the series based in, memory. And it was very interesting because I wondered if she was sort of picking that up from the way other artists of the time were approaching their work in this serial way. Because I've never really seen that. We've seen her talk about it the same way.
That's interesting. And that actually brings up what maybe last sort of, and then we can open it up, but which is sort of beyond the specifics of the interviews included in this particular book. I think that what you just said about Frankenthaler and providing something new, like how do we think about the value of this kind of publication, like for research and scholarship?
This is the basic building block of any research. You talk to somebody who spent hours at the Archive of American Art in Washington, D.C.
You're here for a reason.
Yes, so I think this is good. And it's true. I would say the same thing as someone who has read many interviews with many artists. There is a certain degree of redundancy, but that's any archival work. You do that, and then you find the one nugget that was never said before. I mean, for me, hearing Claes Oldenburg talk about toilets for like 3 pages. That was new. That was worth the price of admission. He has some very interesting things to say about toilets. I'll just leave it at that.
And Solomon really encourages it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So just having this available. I mean, it's true that more and more things are available online. But there's also something to be said for having things at hand. And these are online, as far as I know.
They are now. The entire Solomon paper, everything's digitized, so it's all on our website. But they're hard to read. Guys. They're typescript. There's corrections. Some of them have writs, yellow tape in a good bit, and so they're not easily read.
If you want to make me like a offense about books,
No, I just it just yeah, but I think it is really interesting that even someone who spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about and reading about and studying and being about Frankenthaler would find a new little nugget in part of the material that was not published. And I think that that's sort of the thing that I always come back to with things like this is that so often some of the most interesting material isn't what makes it into the published version of an interview. If you think about, we had this amazing discovery a few years ago with Gene Swenson's interview with Andy Warhol, where there's this tiny little, very short little version of it that's was published by I think Art News and has been in every anthology. And then the whole rest of the interview is amazing. And there's this whole section where he talks about being gay and like now, of course, like that was not available, and it just kind of, it confirmed a lot of things that people already knew, but it just really, I think there are things that open up the field for scholars now, and you actually have coming straight from courses out, as it were.
Well, you get the context. Yeah. How certain questions lead to certain answers. When you use those questions, the answers seem very different. That's a similar case with the French interview with Stella and Gerard that appeared in this place. Right, exactly. And there's a whole other interview that was taken out. And so what they're actually saying is not exactly what that interview presents itself.
We have a few minutes for questions if any of our audience has questions.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is fascinating, and it's also fun to just kind of dive into the history of people who know so much about it. 1962 was Walter Hobbs's new paintings of common objects in Pasadena, which was pretty much, as far as I can tell, against that regional divide. It was New York artists, it was LA artists, and it was some Midwesterners from the middle who just didn't really fit anywhere else. So I'm curious about your opinion on this emphasis on the new. I mean, Solomon is putting it into his exhibition titles, he's asking about the scene. Why in this moment, why in this environment, if you will, is the new so essential?
That's a good question. I think, I would argue that it's a generational feeling that we associate with the 60s. There's a sense that previous generation was responsible for, the catastrophes of World War II, the Holocaust, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But there's a sense that a new sort of way of being in the world is necessary. And in some ways, you can have such expressions, it's still that world of World War II. It's still saying, oh, it's so sad. And what I think this generation is trying to present is we need a different idea of what art could be. It doesn't have to be about personal feelings. It could be something where you just see the world as it is, and again, experience it rather than judge it. And I think, particularly when you think about artists like Warhol and Johns and Rauschenberg, more day, you can imagine why this idea of judgment, which is always related to social norms, right? So there's some of this has to do with what we call, the counterculture, the various liberation movements of the 60s. I think this idea of new is about a real mistrust of the old. And a sense that art itself has to change. That who says that art has to be a painting? Who says that a painting has to be about something noble? And all these long-standing conventions that go all the way back to the Renaissance in many ways are being challenged by these artists. And I would associate that with politics.
I think also that in the sense of people like Hobbes and Solomon, they're responding because they're curators and creators. It's also a moment when the curator becomes a kind of like a sort of public figure himself. I mean, Solomon was, he was a man about town. People knew who he was. He was the kind of, and I think that there was such you're saying an explosion, like the art world suddenly got a lot bigger. Like abstract expressionism was a very tight conversation where you could really, it was a small conversation in a small area of one city. And there's a moment when Solomon's kind of trying to get Johns to admit his influence on all these people, where he's saying this is all your fault. You are the one who opened doors for all of these things in 1957. And John says he's like, no, that's not true. I'm not going to go along with that. And he says something about how information flows around so quickly, and there's so many more people that you can't describe influence in the same way. But I think that for a public, where there's suddenly this explosion of new art making, that's also a sense of the curators are we're going to organize this for you. We're going to explain this chaotic, messy situation. We're going to advocate for you in a certain way. And I think that most of the artists actually push back against that. Poons pushes back against it. Rauschenberg and Johns both do. It's very, it's not quite, I think Noland is a little less that way because it's much more of a straight lineage out of X. But
Solomon seems to really want to stake a position for himself too. I get that he's very much about trying to define this particular movement that he's tracing. And I've been really engaged with for a long time. I think that this came out that earlier when we were talking about it. For sure. So he curated when he was at Voyager at the Jewish Museum.
it was a corner.
He was a corner to do with the common object or something along those lines. It does not sound too dissimilar with the Walter Hope show. But so New York centric as opposed to Tom's example, which is interesting.
Interesting that the show that Solomon was doing, I think he got installed. I don't even know if you ever saw it. It was in 1969. It was for, I think, the new Pasadena Art Museum, and it was called like the second breakthrough in New York from 1959 to 64. So he also just had he had his crew, and he was just, he worked with these people over and over and over again. He had also done little shows with a few of them at Cornell, at dry guns for the Jewish Museum shows.
Probably the effect of someone studying Picasso. Right? Constant innovation.
Or iteration.
Right.
But you haven't talked much about Greenberg and how powerful he was and what a close group that was. He was
Although in some ways, the rise of Johns and Rauschenberg and the pop artists is the moment when Greenberg's power begins to.
yeah, but you haven't talked about it though, as it was, because it was pretty strong.
You see it in the interview with Greenberg. He speaks with such authority, as if whatever he says is absolutely true. He knows he has that power.
But it was a group. I mean, it was like this close group. It was right there. The Poons was right there. He was the center.
Yeah, I mean, so significant for advancing, the work of that. But I didn't notice in reading the transcript of this interview that you have a sense that he almost seemed to be acknowledging the fact that, his time was passing a little bit. I felt that in how he presented some of his ideas, because he was pointing to some things that one would not have expected him to recognize and acknowledge.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the swimming pool closets. I saw that. And Henry was in a boat in a swimming pool.
He talks about that. He said that he wanted Henry because of the shape of his body.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with who he was. He liked the shape of Henry.
Yeah.
He does have a very interesting shape. I saw a picture of him in the Ugo Malus book. A great face. Yeah.
I wonder if in any of the interviews they talk about their studio assistants, because I think Warhol was the only one really open about it, as far as I know. And I worked in the 80s for Dorothea Rockburn, who used to be assistant to Rauschenberg and Jones. And I know how much she influenced, like, for instance, it's silly, but the quilt, how do you call the Rauschenberg painting on the bed cover? You know how she made it for them, because they were always, she would come to work in the morning and they would lie on the floor and they would get sick all the time. So she made it to cover them. And, so they covered themselves. And then he just one day he just put it up there, and that was, and so do they, and I know how hard is that work. For instance, Frankenthaler, she usually exchanged with the Dorothea assistants. So I never went to work for, because they said, forget it. Too much.
Warhol is exceptional the way that
He
kind of
opened.
embraces the idea that he's not making it. Right?
Yeah.
Almost to a point where it becomes provocative. I mean, the interview with Oldenburg at that boot camp makes that explicit.
As does the footage in that episode.
Yeah.
So they do.
Yeah, Oldenburg makes it explicit, and Warhol, of course, does, and Gerard Malanga is also interviewed, and it's Andy even says at a certain point, like, Gerard makes all the paintings.
Yeah.
Which is not
No, but he likes to. But in the most, I don't think in any of the other ones.
I think that's
I mean, Morris, you would think like he didn't know no one else was ever allowed in the room. But
But I think that's still the case. We have a very romantic idea of the artist, as an individual creator. It's not very very often it is.
Unless you have to go to see all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I just, because you mentioned Swenson and this whole question of the new, like, there were so many other curators, like Sam Green also did stuff with the new Babcock. And I guess I don't know much about like his how old was he when he did the interviews, and then what was his relationship to all of these other younger curators that were in critics like Swenson. How old was Solomon? Yeah. He was born in 1920, so he was 44. Yeah, he was older. So yeah, but he was basically about the same age as most of the artists. Like I think he's younger than some, older than others, but yeah, he was 44, 45. So there was more of a divide. But he had spent 10 years at Cornell before coming to Europe, and I think that's also like he tested a lot of these things up there.
There are amazing photographs in the Hollis book of Richard Bellamy getting passed by Rose Seaton.
And Sam Green worked for Dick for a while. Bellamy.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I wonder how Philip Guston fits into this picture, because he also had a show at the Jewish Museum, and that was
That is in 65, right? The Gertrude didn't show? No, that's, I used to know this stuff. 62? Right.
was it?
I think
Before.
No, it's not.
Proceeded.
yeah, preceded.
Before he became figured.
Yeah,
Oh,
that-
before.
yeah.
He was still an abstract.
Yeah. Yeah, Solomon wrote about Guston.
He did.
Yeah, but Guston that's the other generation that is being
That's
kind
not
of left
new.
in the dust.
No.
By these artists.
I'm curious about the Alan Solomon papers. Does it have any documentation about the planning of these interviews?
There are, I haven't looked through everything that he did when he was having his introduction, but I've looked through it. Like there's a lot of material in terms of him getting the show up and running, in terms of how he pitched it to NT and his correspondence with Lane. Now blanking out his last name, but the producer who he worked with, who was much more experienced. Solomon had never made a show before. And they actually went on and they made a couple more shows, a couple more episodes after Solomon kind of left the project. And they're not anywhere, they're really not as interesting in a weird way. Even though the artists are good artists, it's just a very different vibe. But I don't know I think there are some things that allowed Matthew, because the transcripts are mostly undated, but Matthew was able to pin down when these things actually happened. So there is like a certain amount of correspondence about like, when are you gonna come visit me, or like appointments in his date books and things like that. That was kind of like the corroborating evidence, but I don't know that that there was a lot of, or any planning in terms of conversations with the artists about what are we gonna talk about. And how are we going to talk about it?
That's why I was curious.
There might be, but I don't know, and not to my knowledge.
We often have that sort of back and forth reflected in Frankenthaler archives. And there was none that I came across.
I didn't get the impression from reading the transcripts that they had prepared a lot in advance. But again, like some of these people, Rauschenberg and Johns in particular, like he had done 2 shows with each of them by this point, and multiple group shows. So like there was already, and they must have had some of these conversations like earlier on. And that's just the way it works.
You sense it with certain artists, they say, you really want me to tell this again? There are those moments in a few.
This has been a very amazing and fascinating discussion on the discourse of art in America after the war. And I must say, the thing that I really would like to see would be all these interviews on television. Can
You said one was on YouTube, which we'll go and look at those Nolan one, but where are all the others? Can we see them? Or are you gonna make a package so we can all buy it?
I wish. So there are some that are on YouTube. The Lewis and Noland, the Stella and Poons, Oldenburg, Warhol, Lichtenstein, Jim Dine. Apparently, I haven't seen all of them myself. Matthew notes that the MoMA film library has a full run of the programs as broadcast. I assume the WAT archive also does. And then there's at least one other national film and television archive that seems like they have multiple, maybe not the complete series, but others, but they're not digitized. So that's I wish we had them, because we would digitize them.
Well, when you make a show about post-war artists, really, I think it strikes any curator is the ability to dig into archival material, which is so immense, and to have the voice of artists, to listen to the classic is to learn more just from the texture of their discourse about their personality that you can get reading several 500-page biographies. There's something about that voice, you know, and to be able to make that accessible to the public would be just amazing. Because you were asking about what this book would contribute to the discourse on history. Well, I mean, it is history already. It's already there, you know, just simply because it's this objective reflection of a particular moment.
I think we maybe have time for one more question before we wrap
How
up.
the interviews were actually made? Film? So 16 millimeters?
Yeah, they're shot on 16 and then they were edited so that some of it is synchronized, like on just people talking heads essentially, and they used it also for voice to do voiceover tracks for kind of establishing footage of studios and exhibitions and other just kind of.
So they exist edited on film?
Only edited versions, and I don't know that they exist on film. They might only exist on video.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.